Roy O'Connor woke to the cold kiss of steel at his throat. The desert wind pushed through the torn seams of his canvas shelter, stirring the dust into thin, ghostly ribbons, and there she was, an Apache woman. Bruised. Breathless. Fierce, pinning him to the dirt floor as if the whole world rested on her shaking blade. Her eyes, black and blazing, held more thunder than the sky outside. "You move," she rasped, "and you die." Roy didn't flinch, not when the blade pressed harder, not when her breath trembled against his jaw. He only studied her, the blood on her wrists, the fear behind her fury, the wild way she looked like someone who had outrun hell itself and wasn't sure she'd escaped, somewhere beyond the flapping canvas. A coyote cried. Inside, two strangers stared at each other, both one heartbeat away from ending or saving the other's life. Morning light crept slowly across Tularosa Basin, brushing pale sand and scattered yucca with a faint, golden shimmer. The wind carried the scent of mesquite smoke and sun-scorched earth, drifting along the jagged foothills of the Sacramento Mountains where Roy O'Connor had carved out a life far from anyone who remembered his name. His shelter, a weather-beaten canvas, a stone fire ring, and an empty corral, sat like a forgotten bone on the edge of the desert. Inside, Kiona stood tense as a bowstring. Only minutes earlier she'd pressed a blade to Roy's throat, with every intention of ending him, but in that breathless moment, with steel against his skin, she saw something she didn't expect. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. His eyes, gray and worn by years of silence, held no malice, only recognition, as if he'd met death before and no longer feared it. And more than that, she realized his clothes were old military issue, scavenged, not worn with pride. He bore no insignia of Billy Miller's men. The hesitation lasted only a heartbeat, but a heartbeat was enough to stop her hand from finishing what fear had begun. Roy poured her water without a word. Kiona drank slowly, watching him the way a hunted animal watches the shifting shadows of a trap. The wind slapped the loose canvas against its poles, and the desert around them seemed to listen. Then came the hoofbeats. Roy heard them first. His posture stiffened, the instinct of a soldier not yet dead. He nudged Kiona toward the corner of the shelter. "Stay out of sight," he murmured. Not an order, more like a warning. Two riders approached from the north trail, raising dust that glowed orange beneath the rising sun. Jasper Tate and Dirk Hallen. Their silhouettes alone were enough to pull old memories from the ash of Roy's mind. Billy Miller's men. Executioners dressed like cowhands. Roy stepped outside with the slow, deliberate calm of someone who had already measured the cost of violence. He held a double-barrel shotgun loosely in one hand, a half-burned cigar between his teeth. His shadow stretched long across the clearing. "You boys lost." His voice carried flat and cold across the sand. The riders didn't answer. Their eyes slid toward the tent, toward the silent shape hidden inside it. Roy lifted the shotgun just slightly enough for the morning sun to catch the steel. "One step on my land," he said, "and neither of you walks back out." Even the horses seemed to feel the truth of it. Jasper shifted in his saddle. Dirk cursed under his breath, and both turned their mounts, retreating the way they came. In seconds, dust swallowed them whole. Only then did Kiona emerge. She took in Roy's stance, the lingering smoke curling from his cigar, the ease with which he faced two armed men alone, for the first time since they met. Fear loosened its grip on her lungs. She whispered, almost embarrassed by the softness of her own voice. I thought I didn't need a man. I didn't. Roy didn't smile, but something gentler settled in his eyes. He set the shotgun aside and sat near the fire pit, motioning for her to join him. And she did. The tension between them cracked, not broken, but softened enough for truce to slip through. She spoke of her tribe taken as slaves beyond the valley, of Billy Miller's cruelty, of the night she ran. Roy listened, offering pieces of his own past in return. 2 wounded lives, drawn together not by trust yet, but by the recognition of someone else carrying a burden heavy as their own. In the hush of that early light, the desert watched quietly as the beginnings of a fragile alliance took root between them. The desert had a way of holding silence, stretching it wide, letting it settle thick between 2 people who didn't yet know what to make of each other after the riders disappeared. Kiona lingered near the edge of the clearing, her fingers grazing the handle of her knife out of habit rather than threat. Roy O'Connor watched her from beside the dying fire, elbows resting loosely on his knees, the ember of his cigar fading to a dull red. "You can sit," he said quietly. She didn't move right away. Trust was not something she granted, even when unarmed men told her to rest. But the wind shifted, bringing the smell of smoke and hot sand, and Kiona finally stepped closer, lowering herself opposite him with the same wary grace of a creature half feral, half exhausted. For a long while, they said nothing. Roy studied her not in the way men sometimes looked at Apache women, but with the sober understanding of someone who recognized pain when he saw it. Her wrists were raw. Her cheekbone carried a faint bruise beneath the dust. Her hair, thick and black, hung in uneven strands from where it had likely been grabbed during her escape. But there was steel in her posture, a resolve that reminded him of soldiers who refused to die even when the battle was already lost. What were they going to do, he finally asked. Kiona lifted her chin, eyes narrowing slightly, unsure whether to answer. "Kill me," she said, "or take me back." She paused, tasting bitterness. "Both are the same," Roy nodded once. He didn't ask who they were. She noted the way he accepted her words without pressing, as if giving her space to decide how much of her story belonged to him. She pointed to his shotgun. "You knew them." "Used to," Roy replied. His tone carried a weight that made the wind seem to hush around them. "Before I stopped pretending certain men were worth standing beside." Kiona studied his face, searching for deception. She found none. Only an emptiness that looked too familiar. Still, she kept her distance. "You are soldier?" she asked. "Was." He answered. One syllable. But it cut deep, like a blade through old cloth. Something flickered in her eyes, a mixture of suspicion and reluctant curiosity. Soldiers follow orders. Even when orders kill people, orders kill. Roy met her stare without turning away. "Some do," he said. "Some stopped." Kiona didn't expect that answer, and it left a small crack in the wall she had built around herself. She shifted her weight, the knife on her belt clinking softly. She studied him differently now. Not as a threat, but as a puzzle. A man who did not raise a hand when she held a blade to his throat. A man who stood between her and 2 killers with nothing but a shotgun and a steadiness that didn't come from arrogance, but experience, perhaps loss. "You did not fight me," she said, voice low. Roy leaned back, eyes drifting toward the horizon where the basin stretched empty and endless. "Because you weren't trying to kill me," he said. "You were trying to survive." The truth of it unsettled her more than any weapon could have. No one had ever read her intentions so easily, not since the day her world was torn open. She looked at him a long time before responding. "You see too much, and you've seen too much," he replied. That hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. The desert wind threaded through their silence again, softer this time, as if recognizing that neither of them stood alone anymore, though neither was ready to admit it. Behind them, the sun slipped higher, casting long shadows across the sand. Two strangers, bound by harm they hadn't chosen, sat facing each other for the first time, not as enemies, but as remnants of two broken worlds beginning, cautiously, to overlap. Evening settled over Tularosa Basin like a blanket of copper and smoke. The sun bled into the horizon, and the air cooled enough that the dust beneath their boots no longer burned. Roy and Kiona sat by the fire, its glow flickering across their faces, painting them in alternating strokes of warmth and shadow. If the morning had bound them together by danger, then the night now bound them by truth. Roy sharpened a knife with slow, rhythmic strokes. Kiona watched him, not out of fear anymore, but because she sensed something tightening inside him, something he hadn't yet spoken. She waited, letting the fire speak first. "You asked earlier why I live alone," Roy said at last. His voice was low, pulled from some deep well of memory. He set the knife aside, eyes fixed on the red coals. "It starts with Billy Miller." That name cut the air sharper than his blade. Kiona's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She needed him to continue. Roy drew in a breath. Steady, but waited. 2 years ago. Miller and I served in the same detachment out of Fort Stanton. Men trusted him. Commanders praised him. But out on patrol, in the dead stretches of desert, he changed. Kiona leaned forward slightly. He started disappearing on night shifts, coming back with silver coins he shouldn't have had. I didn't know then what he was doing, but Jesse Carter, he noticed. Kid had eyes like a hawk and a heart that refused to ignore wrong. Roy's voice thickened. Jesse followed him one night, found Miller trading government rifles to a group of men who weren't soldiers, men who hunted Apache like livestock. Kiona's breath caught, rage flaring behind her eyes. Roy nodded slowly. It wasn't just weapons. He sold maps of patrol routes, told them which way families would flee when villages were burned. They ambushed them before we ever arrived. His jaw clenched until the muscle twitched. Jesse confronted him. Miller shot him in the gut, staged it as an ambush, and we buried the truth with him. Kiona closed her eyes, grief and fury rising like a tide. When she opened them again, her voice trembled with contained flame. "My people, they were taken because of him." Roy didn't speak. He didn't have to. The connection was there, pain recognizing pain. Kiona shifted closer to the fire, her hands balled into fists. "Miller and his men came to our valley at night. They wore no colors, no insignia, so we did not know who they served. They killed the men first, those who fought. They tied the elders. They pulled children from their mothers. I saw one boy, his face in the dirt, crying for his mother while Miller laughed. Her voice cracked like a branch in winter. He wanted to sell us south. Said Apache brought higher price beyond the desert. Roy's fingers dug into the earth. He sold tribal land too. claimed it abandoned, seized it with forged papers. Army never questioned it. He is not soldier, Kiona whispered. Only trader of death. The wind shifted, scattering sparks upward like spirits fleeing the flames. Roy looked across the fire at her. Not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as someone carrying a wound he recognized in himself. How did you escape? He asked gently. Kiona stared into the fire as though watching the memory play out. When they moved us to the trading site north of the old basin, they locked us in wooden pens. Every night, men came to count us like animals. One night, a storm came, thunder scared the horses, broke a post. I climbed out. I ran until my lungs tore. They chased me for 2 days. Then, she inhaled sharply. Then I found your camp. I thought you were one of them. Roy's chest tightened. I know. They sat silently for a moment, letting the fire settle around the truth between them. The desert night was vast, but in its vastness, something had narrowed the distance between two wounded lives. Finally, Roy spoke. Your people, they're still at that trading site. Kiona nodded once. The movement was small, but the weight behind it was immense. Yes, north of the basin, at the canyon fork. They will move them again soon. After that, they will disappear. Roy's mind turned, gears clicking into place. He wasn't a commander anymore. He wasn't even a soldier. But the instincts, the discipline, the quiet brutality of planning those things never left a man fully. He looked at her wrists, at the trembling resolve in her breath. You came here because you were running, he said, but you stayed because you want to go back. Kiona met his gaze. For the first time, there was no wall, no guarded anger, only truth. I cannot fight alone. Roy exhaled, long and steady. He reached for the shotgun beside him, checking the barrels with practiced precision. When he looked back at her, there was purpose in his eyes, real, iron purpose. You're not alone anymore. Kiona blinked hard, a shimmer crossing her eyes. She didn't thank him. Words were too small for this moment. Roy drew a rough map in the dust, marking ridges, water cracks, vantage points. We'll need to scout at dawn, he murmured. Find the guard rotations. Count their rifles. You'll show me where they keep your people. Kiona leaned closer, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. I remember everything. Of course she did. Survivors always do. The fire burned lower, and the night wrapped around them like a vow. For the first time since Jesse's death, Roy felt a direction not forward, not back, but toward justice. And for the first time since her capture, Kiona felt a hand beside hers, not pulling or pushing, but ready to lift. Under the quiet stars of the basin, two broken histories aligned into a single resolve. They would fight, they would return, and they would bring her people home. Dawn spread slowly across Tularosa Basin, a pale ribbon of gold cutting through the desert sky as Roy and Kiona moved north. The air was cool, holding the faint scent of juniper and dust. They walked without speaking, but the silence between them had changed, no longer the silence of strangers, but of two people sharing the same destination for different reasons. The wagon tracks appeared, first deep grooves carved into the earth, leading into a narrow valley. Kiona stopped, lifting her hand, her eyes sharpened. There, she whispered. Roy followed her gaze. Below them lay a rough encampment, 3 long holding pens, built from uneven timber, 2 canvas tents, and a wagon with broken wheels. Smoke curled from a fire pit. A few guards milled around lazily, unaware of the watchful eyes on the ridge above. Roy's stomach tightened. Men, women, and children sat inside the pens, exhausted shadows of the community they once were. Some leaned against each other, others clutched their knees, staring blankly into the dust. "How long?" he murmured. Kiona swallowed. "Too long." Movement caught their attention. A rider approached from the east trail, the sun glinting off the metal at his saddle. Roy tensed when he recognized the posture, the arrogant tilt of the hat, the relaxed swagger of someone who feared nothing. Billy Miller. "Miller comes to count them," Kiona said tightly. "He chooses who to sell next." Roy watched from the ridge as Miller dismounted and barked at the guards, kicking over a bucket of water simply because it spilled too slowly for his liking. He tugged a wooden stick through the bars like a man selecting cattle. Kiona's hands balled into fists. Roy placed his hand gently, not stopping her, but grounding her. "Tonight," he said softly. "We free them tonight." Night fell without stars, leaving the valley washed in darkness. The campfire's glow revealed only faint silhouettes, guards, half asleep, half drunk, sprawled near crates. They moved like shadows. First, Roy cut the tether to the horses, letting them wander loose. Without mounts, the guards would be slower to pursue. Next, Kiona scattered small handfuls of dust, laced with crushed yucca root, over the fire. Within moments, the smoke thickened, turning sluggish, soothing enough to make the guards drift into deeper sleep. She whispered an Apache blessing under her breath. Roy didn't understand the words, but he understood the intent. They approached the pens. Kiona whispered to the captives, her voice steady and warm, eyes lifted, hope flickering. Roy used an iron bar to pry the lock loose. It gave with a quiet snap. "Move slow. Stay low," Roy whispered. "Follow Kiona, one by one." Exhausted families slipped out of the darkness and into freedom. A child stumbled. Roy caught him gently. An elder leaned heavily on Kiona. Fear laced their faces, but there was a growing spark belief. But as they reached the last pen, a guard stirred. Roy froze. But Kiona reacted first. She stepped behind the man, gripping his shoulders firmly and covering his mouth. Roy knelt quickly. "Easy, friend, no harm." The guard writhed. Roy held up his hands, keeping his voice calm. "We're not here to kill you. Stay quiet. And when you wake up, you'll still be alive and free to walk away." The man's panic eased just enough for Roy to secure his wrists loosely, not painful, just enough to keep him from raising an alarm. Kiona eased him to the ground. "Let's move," she breathed. The group slipped into the foothills, climbing through narrow passes until dawn painted the world pale blue. Only when they reached a hidden canyon did they finally allow themselves to rest. Exhausted Apache survivors huddled near the rocks. Kiona knelt beside a woman who couldn't stop trembling. She held her hands, singing softly until the shaking stilled. Across the clearing, Roy handed out water, his voice gentle, offering comfort where he could. Kiona watched him, something tender warming her gaze. "You care for them," she murmured. Roy shrugged. "No one deserves chains." "Billy Miller thinks they do." Roy's expression darkened. "Miller thinks profit is worth more than a soul." 2 mornings later, Roy revealed a stash hidden behind a false rock wall: ammunition, ropes, lanterns, old military rifles he had salvaged years ago. Kiona's breath caught when she saw them. "You saved these?" Roy nodded. "Never knew when they'd be needed." He motioned for the men to gather. "These aren't for killing," he said firmly. "These are for defending yourselves, for ending what Miller started." Training began. Roy taught them how to hold a rifle, how to aim without wasting bullets, how to hide tracks in the sand, how to move as a unit. Kiona trained beside them, demonstrating how to silently disarm an opponent or tie a wrist with speed and precision. No death, no bloodshed, just skill, discipline, and the will to reclaim what was taken under Roy's instruction. They learned how to topple a man without breaking him, how to snare ankles with rope, how to blind an attacker with sand. They learned that strength was not about destruction but control. By the third day, a small force of Apache warriors stood ready not to kill, but to liberate. That night, with the fire low and the canyon quiet, Roy traced lines in the dirt, the layout of Miller's outpost. Guard patterns, places of weakness. Miller won't expect resistance. He said, "He's arrogant. That's our advantage." Kiona leaned closer. "We strike at dawn." Roy shook his head. "No. Dawn blinds the valley. Sunset hides us better." When Kiona looked up, Roy saw something in her eyes, a determination forged from grief, and a gratitude she didn't yet know how to express. "Why do you help us?" she whispered. Roy answered simply, "Because someone has to stop him, and because I'm done running from ghosts." Their eyes held for a long moment, two paths crossing, then aligning. Kiona nodded slowly. "Then, tomorrow, we take back our land." "Together," Roy said. She placed her hand gently over his. "Together," she echoed. The sun was slipping behind the ridge when Roy stepped out of the shadows, shotgun resting calmly at his side. At the same moment, Apache warriors emerged along the edges of the camp, silent, precise, forming a tightening circle. Billy Miller spun toward his men, but Jasper Tate and Dirk Hallen were already subdued, wrists tied and mouths gagged beside the supply crates. No struggle, no blood, just the clean efficiency of people who had suffered enough to learn restraint. "What is this?" Miller barked, trying to back away. Kiona answered by flicking a looped rope around his ankle. With a sharp pull, Miller hit the ground, cursing as two warriors pinned his arms. "You're done running, Billy Miller," Roy said quietly. "Now you'll face what you've done." Roy inhaled deeply. Kiona tightened her grip on the rope she would use to bind the men who once bound her people. Behind them, the Apache survivors waited, not as victims, but as a tribe ready to reclaim itself. This was no longer escape. This was reclamation. Roy tied the last knot on a coil of rope and stepped back. Miller snarled behind the gag Roy had placed on him, but his eyes, wild with fury, reflected something else too: disbelief. He had not imagined anyone would challenge him, least of all the man he once believed too broken to rise again. Kiona approached quietly, the soft tread of her moccasins barely stirring the dust. Her people moved around her, gathering supplies stolen from their homes months ago, guiding elders out of the pens, comforting children with whispered lullabies. This time, no one cried in fear. The tears that fell were of relief. Roy brushed the dirt from his palms. "Your people, they handled themselves well. They handled themselves with honor." Kiona corrected, but her voice softened. "Because you taught them how to fight, without becoming like him." Roy looked away, embarrassed by praise he wasn't sure he deserved. "All I did was give them tools." Kiona stepped closer, her eyes gentle in a way he had rarely seen. "Tools do nothing in the hands of a man with no heart. But you have heart. Even when you try to bury it." Roy huffed a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "Wasn't sure I had much left." She studied him, as if reading the memories etched across his face. "You still carry Jesse," she whispered. Roy's shoulders stiffened. I do. Does helping us lighten that burden? Roy glanced toward the canyon, where the last families were being released from confinement. The sight hit something in him that had long been numb. Maybe, he said, maybe he'd have wanted this me doing something that mattered. Kiona nodded. He sees you, she murmured. I think he is proud. Roy swallowed hard. He wasn't a man easily undone. Yet Kiona's words slipped past his defenses like water finding cracks in stone. The sky deepened into indigo. A fire was lit in the center of the reclaimed camp, and the Apache gathered around it in a circle. They sang not loudly, not in celebration, but in mourning for what was lost, and gratitude for what was saved. Kiona joined them, her voice weaving through the others like a thread of midnight wind. Roy lingered at the edge, watching her. There was strength in the way she carried herself, not just as a survivor, but as a leader shaped by love for her people. He realized then how long it had been since he believed in anyone, and how quickly she had undone that. When the song ended, Kiona crossed the clearing toward him. The fire behind her painted her hair in warm streaks of gold and ember. She stopped close enough that Roy felt his breath catch. You saved them, she said quietly. We saved them, Roy corrected. She hesitated just for a heartbeat, then placed her hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, firm, steadying. I had courage to run, she said, but you gave me courage to return. Roy met her gaze. You were brave long before I showed up. Brave alone, she murmured, voice trembling with honesty, is a lonely kind of brave. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It thrummed with something unspoken, fragile and brave in its own way. Roy exhaled slowly. What happens now? My people will return to the mountains, Kiona said, to the land they belong to. They will rebuild. She paused. But they know I cannot stay. Roy's heart stumbled. You're leaving them, she nodded. My path no longer ends here. I have followed my anger, my fear, my duty. Now, her voice softened, now I follow something else. He didn't ask what. He didn't need to. Kiona stepped closer until the fabric of her sleeve brushed his. Will you walk with me, Roy O'Connor? He didn't answer right away. He looked at the fire, at the freed prisoners now laughing softly, at the man he used to be and the man he was becoming. And then he looked at her, this woman who had held a knife to his throat, but somehow opened a space in his heart he thought long dead. Yes, he said finally. Wherever you're going, I'll walk with you. Kiona smiled small, real, radiant in its simplicity. Behind them, the wind shifted, carrying away the last remnants of Miller's tyranny. Ahead of them lay a path neither had planned, but one they were suddenly eager to take, not as fugitives, not as victims, but as two souls who had chosen each other in a world where choosing anything was already a kind of miracle. Morning light returned to the valley in soft gold, brushing the ground where the camp of Billy Miller once stood. Now, the chaos had faded, tents taken down, pens emptied, and the air calmer than it had been in months. What remained were only footprints, rope fibers, and a handful of battered crates, the quiet remnants of a tyrant's end. The Apache elders approached Kiona, placing their hands on her shoulders as a blessing. Their gratitude didn't come in words, they offered it in their eyes, steady and warm, filled with pride at the strength she had shown. One of the elders nodded toward Roy. He walks with honor, the man said simply. Kiona glanced toward Roy, her gaze softening. Yes, she replied, he does. Roy approached then, giving the elders a respectful nod before turning to her. You ready, Kiona? looked at her people free at last, preparing for their journey back into the mountains. Back home, children clung to their mothers. Warriors stood tall again, their posture no longer bent beneath the weight of captivity. The land seemed to breathe easier around them. "I am," she said, voice steady. "They know I must go." The elders nodded with understanding. "A path chooses the traveler," one of them murmured, "not the other way around." They began the slow ride toward Fort Stanton, leading Miller's horse behind them. The trail stretched blue and bright ahead, the desert glowing like polished copper. The fort rose from the earth like a block of weathered stone, stern, gray, and waiting. Soldiers at the gate froze at the sight, their rifles lowering as recognition dawned. Sergeant Miller one whispered, disbelief cracking his voice, "But he deserted months ago." "He didn't just desert," Roy said, pulling Miller forward with a single tug. Dust lifted around his boots as he approached the lieutenant who hurried out from the command post. He sold government rifles, he traded patrol routes, and he sold Apache families into slavery. Roy tossed a worn leather ledger into the lieutenant's hands. Pages spilled open lists of stolen weapons, transaction notes, maps, dates, profits, a neatly recorded history of betrayal. The yard fell silent. Soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, shame creeping into their posture as they faced the truth of one of their own. Miller tried to speak behind the gag, but Roy pulled him forward again. "Save it for the tribunal." The lieutenant swallowed hard. "Corporal, take Sergeant Miller and the prisoners to the holding cells. They'll stand before a military court at dawn." 4 soldiers moved in, untying Miller only long enough to shackle him again. His face twisted not with rage now, but with the stark realization that the world had shifted against him. Jasper and Dirk followed, their protests useless against iron cuffs and the cold eyes of men who no longer defended them. As the gates closed with a heavy thud behind the prisoners, the weight in Roy's chest loosened just slightly. "But enough, Jesse can rest now," he whispered. They mounted their horses again. Neither looked back at the fort. Justice was behind them. The future rode ahead. After a long silence, Kiona spoke softly. "What now?" Roy turned his head slightly, catching her gaze. "We find a place that wasn't built on pain," he said. "A place to start again." Kiona exhaled like someone who had run for too many years, and finally stopped. "Then, let us ride until we find it." Ahead of them, the desert opened into endless possibility. Side by side, they rode into the bright morning, 2 silhouettes moving across the endless horizon, leaving behind ghosts, chains, and the echo of a past finally put to rest.